Yes. So there's often a question of what what does Afrocentricity mean, or what is Afrocentricity? So we might start with, whenever you get a term like this, look at defining them. So the Afrocentrism, which is now most often called African-centeredness, is a way of looking at history or historiography from the perspective of people of African descent. And it's a way of rethinking or re-examining that history from their perspective. It comes about from a notion that the way in which history has been taught has denied or excluded those same people.
Afrocentrism to me is a term that was kind of coined by the early African researchers during what you could classify as a renaissance in African history, that is, melanated or black people globally taking back their history, or at least re-exploring it after a long period of what you could classify as Eurocentric domination. So I'd classify Afrocentricity or Afrocentrics as the early iteration. I think it was Dr. Malefic.
When he began to develop a specific set of historiographical principles, methodologies, ideologies, and ways of thinking, and reclassify them under that umbrella, he was carrying through a tradition that was many, many hundreds of years older than him. But he was categorizing it within a certain kind of way in order to facilitate the African onto the world stage as being part of world history. And let me just illustrate this point a little bit further. Part of the dehumanizing process of the dismantling of the African personality is to remove the history from that personality.
When people have a history, that makes you a somebody. So if you remove the history, you become a nobody. And so your history disappearing, nobody's lamenting the loss of that history. That's why conquerors, colonizers, and enslavers make the people whose history they've conquered, colonized, and enslaved disappear.
What is Afrocentrism to me? It's the focusing on black stories, because when you mention the word Afro, Africa, everyone pretty much knows what you're talking about or who you're speaking about. It doesn't really matter what someone wants to do with that term post fact and kind of besmirch it, as is the case nowadays. It is just the focusing on black stories, black history. That's all it is, and that's what it is to me.
Why is this important? Why is history important? Well, the answer is, let's go back a bit. In the process of enslavement, when people of African descent were made into property, especially under the European systems, the idea was to strip these people of name, language, culture, and religion, and to say that these people had no name, no language, no culture, and no religion. All of this was to facilitate the concept that they had no history. They had no history, and so therefore all the other points fit into that notion. So this was to claim that these are people who have never had civilization and do not have civilization, and therefore by enslaving them, that is giving them the opportunity to be connected to a higher civilization. And so one could see that the emphasis on an African-centered approach is in fact a statement of humanity. It is not a question of being pro this or pro that or anything else. It's about a statement of humanity saying that these people are human, they are human, and they have a human history. And this human history fits within world history.
Do I consider myself an Afrocentrist? Yes, I do, but not an Afrocentrist alone. I like to think of it. I don't like to be put in a box, and I've come to a stage now that whereby I realized life isn't about fitting in. You can't always put people in neat little boxes. So yes, I do consider myself an Afrocentrist, but much more, because I believe whilst I'm focusing on black stories overlap with other people's stories.
Am I still an Afrocentric when I'm looking at European history? Am I still an Afrocentric if I start exploring Chinese history? Am I still an Afrocentric when I'm doing my reconstructions? You know, in many ways, it can be a useful term, but it can also deliberately be pigeonholed and debilitated, which is why I try to avoid applying it to myself, but also respect, and I'm okay with the fact that people may apply it to me, as long as it's not done in a derogatory or limiting fashion.
How does my work fit? How would you categorize it? Well, I try not to categorize it. I leave that for others to do. Sometimes, as a methodology of excluding people of African descent history, that history gets classified as something in order to remove it, to disparage it, to reduce its status and importance. So they say, oh, that's just this black history. This is that woke, politically correct nonsense. This is that stuff that these snowflakes read, and it's not relevant, it's not important. What one has to do, and this is very important, is show how this history is intertwined and a fundamental aspect of world history, and that includes British and European history. So I wouldn't say that my history or the way in which I teach or the way in which I write could be excluded in that way, although people try to do so. I am a historian and I work with the history of human beings. I do emphasize the voices of people who have been kept out of that history, but my history is human history, and the history, British history and European history in particular. So that's the way I would like to classify it. But of course, it does include people that some other historians exclude. If one looks at the individuals who are often attributed as being the founders of Afrocentricity or Afrocentrism, and I'm talking about the people in the 1920s and 1930s, people like Arthur Schoenberg and Professor John Henrik Clarke and J.A. Rogers and these types of people, they will say to you that there is no such thing as Afrocentricity or Afrocentrism, and they will also tell you there's no such thing as black history. What there is world history, and then the history of people of African descent has been excluded from that world history, and that they are emphasizing that part that has been excluded from world history.
It's not really to put those stories above and beyond anyone else's stories, but to put them alongside.
I think in order to give a good answer, or at least understand what it means to decolonize, we have to unpack what colonization is.
The modern world of today didn't start today, it started in 1492. And what happened in 1492? Europe became the most powerful people on the planet. The fact that Europe has conquered, colonized and enslaved the rest of the world means that Europe controls information about the rest of the world.
So at the moment, as Africans, or at least people around the world in various diasporas, we are in a process of decolonizing. That is removing those old leadership structures which also came with which also came with deliberately limiting paradigms of understanding ourselves and understanding our history, understand where we fit in.
And they've been able to control the information in two ways. They control it directly by controlling information, and they control discourse around the information. Now, once people are in a position to control information, they are able to decide what goes into the schools, what goes into colleges, what goes into universities. They are able to decide whether or not a particular book gets stocked in a bookshop. They are able to decide what TV documentaries get made about certain information. And essentially, Europe has had something of a monopoly, and they've been able to use that monopoly to present themselves as the centerpiece of world history, world culture, world civilization, and remove us and the Native Americans completely from world history.
And I think the West is so far up its own behind. I say that because even people who are not ethnically Western or European imbibe these lies and are self-perpetuators of these lies. So that's how good a job the West has done in terms of making history a certain way. So when a society is like that, to come along and say, actually, there is another part to the story, there is another side to the story. I was speaking about the Moors earlier. When someone comes and says that, people don't want to hear that, because we're the best, we're the greatest, and we've always been the greatest. In fact, it's almost a God-given right that the West, it's preached as a God-given right and a God-given position, that the West and European civilization is on top, and it was always meant to be like that. But when you start telling people that wasn't always that way, history runs in cycles. Today you're up, tomorrow you'll be down. Today you might be down, tomorrow you'll be up.
So there's that famous African quote, or at least that kind of like African philosophy expression that says, the tale of the hunt always glorifies the hunter. And if you look across the various colonies, you will see that the history of the nations that are still colonized glorifies the people that colonized them. And I think actually, as students of history who are developing our understanding of our surroundings, I think often we have relied upon a historical foundation and a historical framework that was set up to glorify the colonizer. Africa has been victim of that for a very, very long time. You can see it in our current education systems, where the books and the education system that we've got, the legal systems that we've got, everything seems to glorify the colonizer, and that mindset seeps into people. So this process of decolonization goes very, very deep, because it means we have to essentially get rid of that Stockholm syndrome, reassess our relationship with these ex-colonizer nations, and realize the habits that we are currently engaging in that are damaging to our own development.
Unfortunately, even some African leaders believed it, or at least repeated the notion as if they did believe it. We take Booker T. Washington's book, The Negro of the South, and to a certain extent up from slavery. In The Negro in the South, Booker T. Washington, this great leader of Africans in America, claims that enslavement has given Africans the opportunity to connect with a higher civilization and a higher history that they themselves have no connection to. This is a lie, and it's unfortunate that it's coming from the mouth of somebody like Booker T. Washington, but there you have it. It is a lie, and often a lie is repeated so often it gets halfway around the world before truth has even woken up. And this is the reality that we face, that the African history is denied. And this denial of African history is believed, and it's believed today by the vast majority of people that Africans have no history. Even by those people in African countries who should know better, often know very, 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 very little about the history and culture of the countries that they're presidents and that they rule over. Very, very little. And this is also true of African descent people in the Caribbean, in the Americas, in South America, in Europe and elsewhere. The knowledge of African history is so marginal. The knowledge of, and the understanding of it is so fragmented in people's consciousness. And the result is that this space, this absence of understanding of history, culture, and civilization is then filled by a inverted commas black culture that has been created from the worst aspects of human culture, and then people interpret this, absorb it as urban culture, and then they are the reflection of that thing which has been created. And they represent, replicate, multiply, and communicate this mixed up nonsense of a culture, if you can call it that, and become the representatives of that, thinking that that is all they have. This is the worst tragedy, because African civilization goes back to the very beginning of human history. And if you read your research and archaeology right, the human species begins in Africa. The earliest civilizations known to humanity began in East Africa. It is the cradle of humankind, the cradle of civilization, and yet the people of African descent who hail from those civilizations have now got complete amnesia and think that they are something other than what they were born to be.